So let's talk about the outcomes that we projected in the mobility, EV, and buildings policy areas and what policy tools we'd use to achieve those outcomes. First, the first priority would be focusing on reducing vehicle travel through telecommuting and alternative commute modes. The goal here would be to reduce commute travel by 10% via telecommuting by 2030, and to reduce overall vehicle miles traveled by 8% to 11%. So that involves additional policy actions beyond just telecommuting. Now, the second priority, because we're still going to need to use a lot of vehicle travel in Palo Alto, the second priority is to greatly expand EV, electric vehicle adoption. And that means both full-size electric vehicles and small EVs like e-bikes and e-scooters. The first key thing is that the community needs the vast majority of new vehicle purchases to be electric. But we also need people to start buying used EVs, and they're not doing that necessarily so much now. And that means that EV representation in the vehicle fleet older than 3 years falls off sharply. Essentially, people are selling their used EVs out of Palo Alto, or more likely simply returning leased vehicles to the dealership. So people who buy used vehicles need to start buying those EVs, and we need to figure out how to help them do that. If both of these things happen, we project that the residential vehicle fleet could be 50% EVs by 2030, and the multifamily residential vehicle fleet could be 1/3 EVs. This might seem low, but when you realize that the Palo Alto vehicle fleet has vehicles as old as 20, 25, 30 years old, you start to realize that it takes some time to turn this vehicle fleet over. So the faster that we act, the faster we will see those emissions reductions. It's also worth understanding that Palo Alto registered vehicles only represent about 1/3 of the total on-road transportation emissions in Palo Alto. So the third thing that needs to happen here is that people commuting into Palo Alto or visiting Palo Alto also need to start using EVs or alternative commute as much as possible. And we need to develop some innovative programs to help them do that. The goal here is to have EV trips represent a large minority of commuter and visitor trips by 2030. And when combined with improving fuel efficiency due to state policies and continued increases in alternative commute, this would allow the community to achieve the vehicle emissions reductions that are shown in the previous slide. At the bottom, you see the outcomes needed in the buildings area. And this is one of the tougher areas to make progress. Here we're counting heavily on single-family building emissions reductions due to the lower costs of electrifying single-family buildings and the fact that technologies are really readily available to electrify homes. We do expect some significant contributions from electrifying commercial rooftop heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, HVAC systems. But other reductions in the commercial and multifamily sectors may be significantly more difficult. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Now, the policy tools we modeled to achieve these outcomes are listed on this slide and the next one. And I won't go through it line by line, but if I had to summarize it at a high level, I would say we get started on achieving our goals in the next few years, 2021 to 2024, first by raising community awareness of what needs to be done. So people understand we need to electrify these vehicles, we need to electrify these buildings. We also make available a variety of programs to encourage alternative commute by making it easier. And that includes working with local employers to encourage telecommuting through some kind of a telecommuting policy. Parking pricing and other measures can discourage single occupancy vehicle travel. We also need to more widely promote the savings associated with buying an electric vehicle, whether that's a full-sized EV or an e-bike or an e-scooter. We need to expand our EV charging programs. And most importantly, we need to aim to make it easy for homeowners, multifamily landlords, and condo associations and business owners to reduce emissions. In part, this happens by providing some incentives combined with technical assistance or direct installation services. But our ability to provide these programs could be greatly enhanced if we were able to provide on-bill financing as well, which could enable our existing funding to go much further. If we could tap capital markets for the upfront cost of improvements and ideally pay incentives out over time to help customers with repayment obligations, incentives could be paid out to a broader population. Also, in these programs, we would make funding go farthest by targeting the most cost-effective gas appliances that have the highest emissions reduction potential. We can also facilitate EV charger installation through these types of programs. Now, in addition to voluntary programs, we would want to expand our REACH code and do more to remove barriers to building electrification and all electrification. All of this is intended to provide a foundation for the much larger efforts needed in the second half of the 2020s. So around 2024, we need to start looking at ways to ramp up our efforts and get much broader participation in these programs across the community. To give some perspective, during these later years, we might need to see as many as 2,000 to 3,000 building retrofits per year, which is an order of magnitude higher than current permit activity. The policies likely needed to generate this level of participation require significant community buy-in and extensive city support. Many of these ideas really would need some level of voter approval and in order to express that community buy-in, and a lot more work is needed to clearly define these policies. This is work that we can do over the next few years. Some of the more ambitious measures could include carbon pricing. If the community chose to price certain types of carbon, we could use that to encourage more rapid electrification and fund program expansions. Another opportunity to explore is a tax to enable the city to provide more extensive electrification incentives, and mandates to electrify could also be considered. Or the community could look at getting voter approval to discontinue gas service. Again, if community acceptance of building electrification in all electric homes becomes that widespread. During this period, we'd also need to be funding major capital investments to facilitate alternative commute. And that means starting by investing heavily in bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure to make biking and micromobility travel. Micromobility refers to e-scooters and e-bikes. We want to make that faster, safer, and more pleasurable. We also want to enhance the use of transit by making it faster and easier to use through transit priority signaling and bus rapid transit.